Okay, hi. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our November Business 911 speaker series. We're so fortunate today to have Travis Elliott, an attorney, join us. Travis, some of you probably know him in the room. I've gotten to know him a little bit over the last few weeks. Incredible individual. He's with the law offices of Ellis, Hammons and Johnson in Springfield. He is one of the few individuals who is an attorney day and by the day and a farmer by the night and weekends. So he's got a sort of big, broad array of experiences of how to practice law as a citizen and native, a son of sort of rural Missouri. He both practices law in the government public sector. He also has an attorney and a law practice that serves corporate businesses and a variety of other industries. And so he's really going to be talking to us today about the legal elements of what it takes to start a business, whether it's a for-profit business, non-profit business. I know many of our listeners and attendees tend to be in those two areas, both doing public sector work and having their own businesses. So hopefully today's conversation will be helpful as Travis sort of gives us an overview of things to think about, the do's and don'ts from a legal perspective of operating a business. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Travis. Travis, thank you so much for joining us. We're so thankful for you to share your insights with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Rashu. And I'd like this conversation today be as conversational as you all want it to be. If you have questions, feel free to stop me. I've prepared a little bit of a presentation here, but I'm going to probably just speak to the interests of the group here today. As Rashu said, I do a lot of public entity work, represent a lot of businesses, represent a fair number of businesses and individuals in the agricultural sector. As he kind of alluded to, I born and raised on a farm in Dallas County, Missouri. The only 7 years I spent out of Dallas County was in Columbia whenever I went to school, and I came back, and hopefully I'll die in Dallas County, Lord willing. And my office is in Springfield. And so with that, I've kind of broken this presentation down into a couple of categories, and I'm going to probably focus more on the business side, less on the nonprofit organization side, but I am going to speak to some of those issues because it's not uncommon for someone to not exactly know at the beginning what type of business organization that they need or want for the goals and the plans that they have set out in front of them. And so I'm going to talk about some of the foundational things that you all think about. Of course, one of the things that I always recommend is if you're wanting to start your own business or you're working with folks who are looking at starting their own business, you need to surround yourself with good professionals. This is not a plug for lawyers, but I mean, that's one of the stops that probably anybody who's serious about enterprise or venture should talk to. I think it's important to have an accountant. One of the things that I run into a lot professionally is there's things that are clearly in the legal silo that I am usually hands-on with and can answer any questions, but oftentimes that bleeds over into accounting and tax questions that I am not at all qualified and is not in my wheelhouse. And so those are two important kind of, in my mind and in my practice, pillars of a good foundation for starting a business. There's some other things that I won't spend a lot of time talking about, but you all probably know already that are really important. I mean, I think a good business plan is always kind of one of the key foundational pillars to a successful venture that if folks don't have one and don't know how to create one, there's a lot of good resources out there today. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about that. So this slide here that's up right now is kind of a big picture bullet point of the different subjects I'm going to spend time talking about today. And each of them are important. One of the things I run into a fair amount is you kind of have to, whenever you're looking at forming a business, you kind of have to start with a top-down view about what you want to do, and then you kind of have to drill down and say, what are the steps to get there? And then you have to go back up. So, I mean, I look at it as, you look at the big picture, and then you say, what are the steps I need to get there? And then you need to kind of come back to that big picture in order to say, am I moving in the right direction or not? And I think that, your attorney, your accountant, your financial advisor can help kind of hone down and make sure that you're on the right track. Sometimes it's easy to get off track and identify the issues that you need to button down. And so hopefully this presentation will help think through some of those big picture items and kind of get folks on the right path. So we're going to talk about identifying and selecting the right type of entity. Sometimes there's a lot of confusion about what exactly someone needs to do, and that'll depend upon a lot of considerations that I'll spend some time talking about today. Kind of the next step is, once you've identified the kind of entity that you need that will suit your purposes and business plan, is actually creating and forming the entity. And I'll spend a fair amount of time talking about that process. There's going to be some business entities that I identify in these slides that without talking to a professional, you may not know which one it is. And so what I would consider this entire presentation is a very preliminary starting point. It's certainly not a how-to guide and how to take these steps. It's more of a issue spotting and things to think about as you're going down that path. I see a lot of mistakes made in both creation of an entity, but oftentimes more likely in the formation of the entity and the organizational documents. Usually whenever I see those problems are not whenever someone's starting to form a business entity. It's usually whenever they have had a problem. Oftentimes the problem comes in the form of a lawsuit. And so unfortunately, whenever I get involved at that stage of the game, there's not a lot that I can immediately do to fix the problem. We just have to deal with the problem. And so what I love about doing these kinds of presentations is kind of making folks aware of, here's how you avoid even being in that problem in the first place. And so I'll talk a fair amount about that. The last couple of categories there on this slide are, again, things to think about, things to be aware of, because starting a business, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit, is a very formidable task, especially if you've never been involved in that before. And there's legal requirements out there that folks don't even think about. So I'll talk about some of the common things that I see, some of the things to watch out for. And so if you would, Hirshu, advance to the next slide. And so let's talk about, if you were to want to start a business venture or a nonprofit, some of the things that you need to think about. So the first thing that I really think you have to start with is, what are your short-term and long-term goals? What's the purpose of the business entity that you're looking at forming? Do you even need to form a business entity? And so some of the considerations that come into play in those situations are we talking about a for-profit business or a not-for-profit business? That's one of the big picture items that you kind of have to identify in the beginning. Most of the time, it's pretty clear about which one of those paths you're going to want to go down. Sometimes it's not as obvious, and so that's clearly one of the situations where you probably need some professionals to help guide in that decision making, because the worst thing is to spend a lot of time, money, and effort going down a path that either you recognize is wrong and then you have to retrace your steps, or you don't recognize that it was the wrong decision until you have a problem, and then you have to deal with oftentimes legal issues or business problems associated with having the wrong path that you've selected. And so, like I said in the opening slide, I'm going to spend a lot more time today talking about for-profit business organizations. But one of the things that I'm happy to talk about, if there's interest in this group, is some of the steps directly related to nonprofit formation. I've run into a number of challenges brought to me where folks thought they were operating as a not-for-profit entity, but they had never properly organized. Obviously, 501c status of whatever type is that is a process that requires some know-how, and you want to make sure you get it right to properly obtain tax exempt status, both from the federal government, and there's a kind of a separate but parallel process that the state of Missouri requires. And so if there is interest in that, I'm happy to answer questions about the not-for-profit piece, but I'm going to focus more on the for-profit piece. And so with that, I mean, some of the things you need to think about is, are you going to be doing this on your own, or are you going to have partners? Are you going to, what does that look like? And so oftentimes what is best is to start with, what do you want it to look like? And what are your preferences and goals? And then you can kind of start looking at square peg, square hole fits as far as a legal entity to match that. I think that it is much less preferable to start looking at your options as far as a business entity and then try to fit a square peg in a round hole. And so we'll talk about what some of that looks like, but some of the things you should look at is, you know, what kind of control are you going to have over the business entity? Who's going to be responsible for making big decisions and little decisions? Who's going to be contributing, you know, liquid capital? Who's going to be contributing what I consider sweat equity? You know, what are profits and losses going to look like? And so the reality for most small businesses starting off is that you probably shouldn't expect profits in the short term because you're going to have to get it up off the ground. But it is good to think about what that's going to look like, at least as planned, so that you can make some good decisions at the beginning. One of the other things that you need to be thinking about, and the reason why most people form some sort of business entity, is liability protection. And we'll talk about the ways to maximize the liability protection that state law affords folks who form certain business entities. Kind of one of the give and takes with making that determination is the next item on this slide is, you know, the administrative burden. You know, for folks who have been in the business world for a while, you know, for many years, establishing a corporation was in many cases the only way to get various liability and tax liability protection and benefits. With the invention of the LLC, you know, in various states over the past 25 years or so, that oftentimes makes a lot of sense because it is much less administratively burdensome. And so just from my professional experience, I form a lot fewer corporate entities these days than I do LLCs, simply because of the simplified administrative burden. The paperwork that comes with it is much easier for a small business to deal with. The last item on here is tax status, and I will be perfectly honest with everyone, that is not my area of expertise. I only mention that there because it's an important component of, you know, deciding what form of business entity to select and to elect to operate under. It's not my wheelhouse, and I usually defer to the tax professionals in those types of decisions and what the net effect of those decisions would be. So I only mention it there as a point of information, if nothing else. Okay, so let's talk about picking, you know, a type of entity. And I've listed, I won't say that this is an exhaustive list, but it's pretty close in Missouri what our options are. One of the things that you won't see in any of these slides that I've kind of tried to pare down, and I don't mean to take them off the table, but of course there's always an option to organize under another state's corporate business entity or organization laws. I'm only licensed to practice in the state of Missouri, and so that's what I'm most familiar with. But sometimes there are legal and financial and tax reasons why someone might want to organize in another state. Delaware obviously comes to mind because they, out of all the 50 states, they have the most well-developed corporate organization laws in the country. There's lots of people who are most familiar with those. And so sometimes there are good reasons to do that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that today for the reasons that I've already said. So looking at Missouri, one of the tempting things is the first item on the slide is to be a sole proprietor. So basically you have a business idea, you basically go out and start doing business as yourself. That is certainly simple. It's straightforward. it avoids a lot of the discussion that's going to follow from this presentation today. The downsides to being a sole proprietor is the fact that you have no liability protection. That is, if if you enter into contracts as yourself and you're doing business as yourself and something goes wrong in the stream of commerce, if you're not able to perform as promised, you are potentially going to be personally liable for any of those decisions or breaches that might come from it. Similarly, if someone is injured or there's personal property damage as a result of you conducting business, you're going to have potential personal liability there. And so I don't want to be negative, the little black rain cloud in the room as far as being a sole proprietor, but to be frank, I mean, it is so easy to establish some of these business organizations. It's very difficult from a legal perspective to know why one might choose to do that, although there might be good reasons why. And again, I think that goes back to making sure that you have good information in making that decision so that you know what the risks and benefits are in doing that. One of the ones I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about is that second one on this presentation, which is a general partnership. Normally, if you want to form a general partnership, there are very specific reasons for doing so that are probably outside of the scope of this discussion today. And so I'm going to kind of set that one aside. A general partnership can be formed basically just by conduct of the parties, but there's some legal complications associated with that. The next one on the list, and Harshu, I've lost the PowerPoint here, but I can talk about it without it, is the corporation. And as I said, I don't form a lot of corporations. I have and will continue to do so, but forming a corporation is kind of the gold standard for liability protection. And you'll see there in the slide, I've identified some kind of subcategories. If you've heard of a close corporation, a professional corporation like our law firm is, it's solely owned and managed by people who are licensed to practice law in the state of Missouri. And so there are some very specific reasons why you might form some of those subcategories of corporations. The downside to having corporate status is the fact that there are some administrative filing requirements and some cost and some ongoing maintenance of effort with respect to annual reports to the state. But a corporation is not ever a bad move. It's just that oftentimes there are better options out there, especially for small businesses. The next one in this list is the one that we'll probably spend the most time talking about, which is the limited liability company. And so if you compare a corporation to a limited liability company, the administrative burdens associated with an LLC are much less than that of a corporation, just on an ongoing basis. You get similar types of asset protection, limited liability, both with respect to financial decisions as well as, personal injury and property damage issues that can come along with that. And so those are the two we're going to talk the most about. The next three, a limited partnership, a limited liability partnership, and a limited liability limited partnership, have very specific purposes, and there are very specific pros and cons to those that I will set to the side for the purposes of today's discussion. The last item there is kind of the outlier, a nonprofit corporation. Obviously, a nonprofit corporation has some elements and characteristics associated with it that are much different than these others. The main one being that it is operated purely for, some sort of nonprofit purpose. That is, it's either religious, charitable, fraternal, educational purposes. And the idea behind a nonprofit corporation is you don't have shareholders, you don't have members, you don't have a distribution of profits to the shareholders or the members. Rather, the profits of the entity or the excess revenues of the entity are for the purpose of putting back into the entity itself to extend the charitable purpose that it is designed for. And so, again, I'm happy to answer questions about that. A nonprofit corporation operates through its board of directors. There is a very specific formation process that you go through to form that. And there are certain requirements in a nonprofit corporation's bylaws. For example, if a nonprofit corporation is for some reason terminated or dissolved, you have to designate some entity or some type of entity that is consistent with the nonprofit corporation's purpose, so that those assets in the event of termination or winding up are distributed to another entity that has a similar or like purpose. Lots of people are under the notion that a nonprofit corporation can't make money, and that's simply not the case. A nonprofit corporation can operate in the black, so to speak. It's not obligated legally to operate in the red. It's just the function of making money or having excess revenues has to go back into the entity itself. Now, the other explanation I always like to give along with those comments is the fact that, employees can be paid. The president of the nonprofit corporation or the CEO can be paid. They can make money as a result of the labor of their effort. It's just that there are no shareholders. Rashu, if you would advance the slide. Thank you. So I'm going to break this next subject down into a couple of different pieces. This slide does so by explanation, but the general idea here is that there's kind of two silos that that result from what entity you're going to operate under. So the first two bullet points there with a sole proprietor or a partnership or a general partnership, you don't have to have any sort of formation or creation document in order to operate as a sole proprietor. You just, by default, operating as an individual, are a sole proprietor. That's similarly true with respect to a partnership. You don't have to file any document with the Missouri Secretary of State's office. And so you don't have to really do anything to have a sole proprietorship or a partnership. What I will say is, for those of you who might elect or be thinking about operating as a sole proprietor, one of the things that I see folks maybe stumble on from time to time is, for example, if I wanted to start a small business making widgets of some sort, technically speaking, unless I do a fictitious name registration with the Secretary of State's office, I would have to hold myself out in the stream of commerce as Travis Elliott. If you want to do business as another name, what you need to do is to file a fictitious name registration with the Missouri Secretary of State. So if I want to operate as, Elliott Manufacturing, I would need to file that fictitious name registration with the state. And the whole purpose of that name registration is that it allows other people to know that if they see Elliott Manufacturing, that they have a way to tie Elliott Manufacturing to me as the individual doing business as Elliott Manufacturing. A couple of side notes on fictitious name registrations. There is not name protection with respect to a fictitious name registration. So if you do file one of those with the Secretary of State's office, any number of folks out in the stream of commerce can file a fictitious name registration or a DBA with that same name. So just because you do that registration doesn't give you name protection, which is different than if you form a corporation, you form a limited liability company. There is name protection associated with taking those actions with the state. And so there is some benefit to name protection with having a formal business organization that doesn't come along with a DBA. One of the things I will mention, one of the differences between being a sole proprietorship and being a partnership is, of course, if you're a sole proprietor, you're just in business with yourself. compare that to a partnership where you're going to be in business with some other folks. And so if you're going to be in a partnership with other folks, you don't necessarily have to file any sort of formation document with the Secretary of State's office. However, as far as a best practice recommendation that I have for folks is, if you're going to be in business with other people, then it is a good idea to have a written partnership agreement so that there is a written understanding between the partners about how business is going to be conducted, and so that there aren't any misunderstandings or miscommunications amongst the partners as to what decisions are being made and how they're going to be made and how those decisions are going to result from that. That can come in a number of forms. I mean, incurring debt, purchasing real estate, purchasing personal property, and similar type decisions. So those are all important to have hammered out, because it's very tempting to be starry-eyed at the beginning of an exciting business venture, and for partners to say, "Oh, well, there will never be a problem," and that, as one might imagine, only becomes a problem whenever you have situations that things go south, there are disagreements, and if you don't have a written agreement, it's very difficult to separate out the wheat from the chaff and to have a meaningful resolution and dissolution of the partnership. And so good, best recommended practice is to have a partnership agreement in that instance. So let's move on to the more formal business organizations. And Hirshu, I've lost video with everyone. Is that something that I need to do?
Can you not see us?
I can only see you.
Oh, I can see the team. They I see Michelle's waving, so they're good.
Okay.
We can continue. Yeah, I think you're okay.
Very good. I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
So whenever you talk about the more formal business organization formation process, I've kind of laid out in this slide what you should at least have a general idea of what you need to do. A lot of folks are tempted, regardless of whether they're forming a corporation or a LLC, you can go and get those forms off the Secretary of State's website. You can find them online. And I'm not saying you can't do it. One of the problems is there's a whole bunch of internal decisions that need to be made and understandings that need to be had in doing that I see a lot of mistakes made. And they're kind of unintentional, unknowing mistakes at the time. So whenever you talk about forming a corporation, you have to create the articles of incorporation, and those have to be filed with the Secretary of State's office. Once that is done, the actual corporate entity is formed. It has a legal existence. So before you do that, there's a lot of decisions that have to be made. You have to decide, who are the owners. You have to decide who are the officers and directors of the entity. And so I probably see this problem come up with LLCs more often than corporations, but one of the things that doesn't happen sometimes is the drafting of bylaws with a corporation. And the bylaws are the internal governance document about how the corporation is going to function. It says what offices are going to be held, who's going to be president, who's going to be vice president, secretary, treasurer, how is the capital of the company going to be formed, and how is it going to be handled for tax and accounting purposes? What are the rules of the road with respect to meetings and decision making? What authority is going to be given to the officers of the corporation? What authority is going to be reserved in the shareholders of the corporation? How does a shareholder get bought out? What happens if a shareholder exits the company? Those sorts of things are all contemplated in bylaws, which are not filed with the Secretary of State. That is a private document amongst the shareholders of the corporation, but it's a very important document, both for planning purposes as well as operation purposes. And so I probably see bylaws not getting written less often than whenever we jump down to limited liability companies. So let me talk about that and then go into that in a little bit more detail. So the corollary in a limited liability company to the articles of incorporation of a corporation is called the Articles of Organization. And that, again, is the creation or the formation document that gets filed with the Secretary of State's office. And once it does so and it's accepted, you then have the legal existence of the limited liability company. That's oftentimes where self-starters kind of come up short in the creation and formation process, in the sense that they find out that they have to have articles of organization, they complete those, they file them with the Secretary of State, and they think that they're good to go. Unfortunately, especially if it is a multi-member LLC, that is, there are multiple owners, this goes back to the comments I made about having a partnership. The operating agreement is kind of the governing internal document of an LLC that is very important. And it is all too common where I have someone contact me where the members or the owners of the LLC have gotten into a disagreement. There is an impasse with respect to the direction that the business is going, or financial decisions, or disagreements over business decisions. And of course, whenever someone comes to me and a lawsuit has been filed, I say, do you have an operating agreement? Or more likely, can you provide me a copy of your operating agreement? And I usually get one of three responses. Either in the best case scenario, they have one and it's a good one, and I'm able to look at that and see where the members of the entity stand with respect to each other and the dispute that's going on. More often, the other two things happen is they say, what's that? What's an operating agreement? We don't have one of those. What is that? Should we have one? And so that's problematic, especially in the case of a lawsuit or a disagreement amongst the owners, because you don't have any rules of the road about how things should have happened. And so you have to deal with the consequence of not having a formal understanding amongst the owners before the dispute arose. The other thing that is very common that happens is they do have an operating agreement, but oftentimes it's kind of the self-help version of an operating agreement where they've gone online, they've Googled it, they found, oh, there's an operating agreement, they changed the name and signed it, without understanding any of the legal decisions that have been considered when whoever drafted that operating agreement put it online. And so sometimes you end up with an operating agreement that just doesn't answer any questions about decision making and capital accounts and decision making with respect to the business, which is difficult to then sort out how the dispute should be resolved. And so I guess what I would recommend to anyone who's seriously considering forming an LLC is to say, at a minimum, go in and talk to an attorney about what it would cost to prepare both articles of organization and an operating agreement, because there are a lot of business decisions that are made unintentionally at that stage of the process that a lot of people don't consider and don't think through and talk with their co-owners. And so it's a very important process, and it can usually be done fairly economically. But it's important to get someone who knows what they're doing. And that's one of the things that most people think, well, anybody can do that. I mean, I can find the forms online. And I don't want to knock some of the online services that are available, but things like LegalZoom come to mind, where you may get the forms, but you don't get the information about how to make good business decisions and filling out and drafting and creating the information that ultimately gets put in the operating agreement. So I don't want to belabor the point, but it's a very pivotal decision-making point in the process that shouldn't go ignored or that you're unaware of at the time.
Hey, Travis, I was wondering if maybe we could take a quick pause and see if there folks have any questions. I know there's a lot of incredible content that you shared with everybody. I'm just going to stop sharing for a second so folks can see you.
Sure.
I don't know if people have any reactions or questions. This is very technical, and there's a lot of nuances to what Travis is sharing. Any areas that people are listening to that you want Travis to spend a little bit more time talking about, or anything that caught your attention?
Rashu, I think Kim has a question here in Aurora.
Go ahead,
Are
Kim.
you ready for it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. If you have bylaws and the operating agreement and the LLC paperwork in place, but yet, 10, 15 years down the road, you want to make some amendments or changes, what does that entail? Is that an easy fix? It's not like starting over. Can you go to that Secretary of State website and amend
Sure.
the LLC agreement, or where do you go with that?
Sure. So good question. It depends. So if we're talking specifically about an LLC, of course, we have articles of an organization that get filed with the Secretary of State's office, and then you have the operating agreement amongst the owners or the members, more correctly, of the LLC. And so there are some decisions that get made in the articles of organization. And so I'm going to back into the answer to the question. If you're making changes to concepts that are contemplated in the articles of organization, that is going to require a decision of the members of the LLC in order to change that by filing an amendment to the articles of organization with the Secretary of State's website. One good example, actually, I can give you a couple of good examples about decisions that that are contemplated in the confines of the articles of organization. So one that is very common is changing who the registered agent is. That is the person who is responsible to receive service of a lawsuit on behalf of the LLC. Oftentimes people will pay a company that serves as registered agent for thousands of LLCs in the state of Missouri. And maybe you want to change it from maybe someone who was an employee formerly with the company to a company that does that kind of service, or maybe the lawyer who did the formation paperwork for the entity was the original registered agent, and you want to change that to a member of the LLC. So that's one thing that that change or that amendment would have to be made and approved by the members and then filed with the Secretary of State's website. Another good example of something that gets changed that requires an amendment to the articles of organization is the purpose of the LLC. So if you originally file the articles and say, for example, the business purpose is to operate a used car dealership, and then the company changes to some other business purpose or expands its business purpose, you might need to file an amendment to contemplate that change. Now, I will tell you as an aside, most people, whenever they file what the business purpose of an LLC is to do so-and-so and all other legal purposes in order to avoid having to file those sorts of amendments. So there are a number of different things that, if you're going to change, have to result in amendment to the articles of organization. Compare that to internal business decisions that are contemplated in the operating agreement. The members consider and approve those changes within a revision to the operating agreement. And that operating agreement, that is not public record. It doesn't get filed with the Secretary of State's office and can be done entirely internally. Now, your question that I'm backing into that raises a great point is that question itself is the reason why it's so important to have an operating agreement from the beginning, because a good operating agreement is going to lay out the process by which the members of the LLC can amend the operating agreement or can amend the articles of organization. And so you can see the problem that if you don't have a good operating agreement that contemplates those kinds of changes and amendments, oftentimes you're left a little, wanting about how do we go about that. So, the operating agreement, if well drafted, is going to lay out a roadmap for how you do that. The other thing that I will mention that your question kind of raises is, I don't want to create the impression that if you don't have an operating agreement, that there's no answers to any of the questions that might come up. There are a number of what I call, in legal terms, are statutory gap fillers. In common sense, what that means is there are statutory provisions that apply to limited liability companies that if your operating agreement doesn't answer the question, there may be state law that answers some of those questions if your operating agreement doesn't answer it. So again, there are some default provisions in law that can apply even if you don't have an operating agreement that answers some of those questions. So I hope that answers your question probably more than you wanted.
It does, but it makes me have 2 more questions. Is that
Sure.
okay?
Of course.
Can those amendments be filed online, or do you mail them in? And is there a fee?
Yes and yes. So the Secretary of State's website has a fairly robust online filing system. My recollection is that you can still file by paper on some things. There are some things that you have to file on paper, but most, I mean, like forming an LLC and filing the articles of organization can be filed through their online business portal. It's a very easy process. There is a fee, and the fee is determined by what business entity you're talking about and what the nature of your filing is. I can't quote you exactly what the costs are, but for a LLC, I think that the filing fee to do a new LLC is a little over $100. And I've forgotten your second question, so I'll have to apologize. Could you repeat it?
It was, is there a fee, and can you do it online?
Okay. I did answer both of them then.
Very good.
Any other thoughts or questions? That's it, Travis.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Very good.
How to word that.
Will you advance for sure? So this slide, I've probably already covered 90% of it, but just to recap real quickly, if you're talking about sole proprietorships or partnerships, those are kind of the default business forms where you don't have to file or register with the Secretary of State, and really there's no liability protection. Compare that to corporations and LLCs where there's steps you have to take to organize and form by filing with the Secretary of State, and they provide various forms of liability protection. And then kind of that third bullet point that I just want to keep reminding folks is there are, varying tax treatments associated with those forms of organization that I will defer to the tax professionals in answering specific questions. So we're going to go to the next step here. For ease of discussion, I'm going to assume that, as a potential business venture that we have decided that we're going to form an LLC, that business form of corporate, organization makes sense for our business. And so it's going to be a multi-member LLC. And let's say there's 10 of us, there's going to be 10 members of the LLC. Each of us are going to be 10% members. One side note that just so you can, if you ever hear people talking or you're talking about forming a business, if you hear shareholder, what you should be thinking about immediately is corporation, because corporations have shareholders and limited liability companies have members. That's one of the things that is helpful from the legal perspective in understanding what form of business entity you're talking about. So, let's say we've decided to form an LLC. We have filed our articles of organization with the Secretary of State's website. You always want to check to see if that name is available before you get real excited and in love with a particular name, because you need to always check to make sure that name is in fact available, and those sorts of things. But let's say that we've established a name. We know that we're all going to be 10% members. We have a good legally sound operating agreement that outlines how decisions are going to be made. And so we've gotten through that formation process, and we have our LLC officially established as a legal corporate existence. So now we're going to talk about some of the things that you need to think about as far as next steps. One of the first things you're almost certainly going to have to do is get a employer identification number from the federal government. Individuals can do that online. My experience is that the simple way to do that is if you have an accountant or a CPA that you have a relationship with and you're working with in this process, that they are able to do that very easily and very quickly. And that is oftentimes the simplest solution to that. Not saying you can't do it yourself. I will warn everyone, there's a lot of illegitimate websites out there that will charge you an arm and a leg to get your employer identification number. If you run across those things, I mean, there is no cost to getting a FEIN or a TIN. There is no cost. And so if you stumbled upon a website that's trying to charge you for that, you should just be aware that it may not be legitimate. And one of the scary things about that is there are some legitimate businesses out there that offer that as a service, and you will ultimately get your tax identification number. But it's scary from my perspective because there is no way to tell the legitimate businesses out there from the illegitimate businesses out there who are doing that. And so I've actually run into that a couple of times where the person stumbled upon the wrong website and they go, well, I'll pay the $150 to get my TIN. And they ultimately got their TIN, but it places into kind of question, is this legitimate or not? And I guess what I would say is any business out there that is purporting to charge you a fee to get what is a free thing from the federal government is probably a bad idea. So that's kind of outside of what I'm really intending to talk about here, but I have run into that a couple of times and it's kind of concerning. So oftentimes it's just easiest to have your CPA or accountant do that, but just know that you can do that yourself and you shouldn't be charged for it. So once you get that FEIN or TIN, then you're going to want to open a checking account probably for the business. And so, oftentimes the members in your operating agreement will say how much each person is going to make as an initial capital contribution to the business. So just for simplicity's sake, there's 10 of us. Let's say we all, throw in $100 just to open a checking account. And so your accountant is going to love you if you do the operating agreement correctly and you do your capital accounts correctly. Some of that gets into tax and accounting issues that I'm not probably qualified to speak to, but the operating agreement is a valuable resource, not just for you and in our hypothetical us as members. It's also a valuable tool for your accountant to be able to properly account for capital contributions and those sorts of accounting decisions in the business, and helps your accountant prepare tax returns and what have you. So, so opening a separate checking account is an important step in the process for a whole bunch of reasons. So one of the things, I'm going to jump ahead here, that's contained in a slide at the very end of this presentation, but one of the things that you don't have to advance, Prashu, I'll speak on it, thank you. One of the very foundational important things that you have to do in forming any sort of business entity is what's in legal jargon called respecting the corporate form, but in more common parlance is basically you have to treat the business entity separate from your own personal business, okay? And that's probably one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of small business owners make, especially if you have partners or members more appropriately. And the consequence of not keeping business and personal decisions and finances separate, if you've ever heard of someone say that there's a lawsuit and someone is attempting to pierce the corporate veil, what that really means is that the owners of the company have treated the business assets and decisions as their own personal monkey bars, basically. And so one of the things about limited liability in forming an LLC, or the limited liability that comes away with forming a corporation, if you mix and match personal and business decisions, what that can end up doing unintentionally is if the LLC gets sued, and if you have not separated and kept business and personal decisions separate, you can end up losing that liability protection, and you can end up being personally liable for those decisions, whether it's a breach of contract, whether it's an automobile accident, a personal injury, or a property damage claim. And so that's one of the big problems that people run into if, maybe personally they're running a little short on cash, but the business has some money in their checking account and they pay personal bills out of the business account. That's a problem. And it's especially a problem if a lawsuit gets filed and you go through discovery, and whoever's suing you through the process of getting documents about the business finds out that you've been playing fast and loose with the corporate assets. They're going to make an argument that we should just completely disregard the LLC entity, and you, or in our situation, all 10 of us as members of the LLC, they're going to sue us personally. And so if you maintain that separation, you get the benefit of the limited liability associated with an LLC. But if you mix and match and play fast and loose, you run the risk of somebody out in the world and in the stream of commerce saying, well, hey, yeah, I understand there's an LLC here, but they've been playing fast and loose, and so we think that they should be personally liable as opposed to the LLC being liable. So that's a real important thing to make sure that you and your co-members are respecting the business entity. Now, that's not to say that at the end of the year, if there's been money made and there's excess money in the form of profits, you can take a distribution and then pay personal bills and what have you, but you certainly don't want to be paying personal bills out of the assets of the corporation or the LLC.
And Travis, just doing a real quick time check. I know we're close to the top of the hour, so perhaps if we could start wrapping up. I don't know if there's any other questions. We can wrap this discussion up.
I actually have another question.
Sure.
So when you talk about the operating agreement, is that something that there is wording out on the internet or through the state of Missouri that is a guideline, or is that something that's best handled when you're setting it up with an attorney? I mean, before you get to that point, you just kind of want to start putting some operating agreement ideas down. Is there a format somewhere?
So I'll give you the non-legal answer. The practical answer is you can absolutely go on the internet and find examples of operating agreements.
Okay.
The thing that you have to be aware of, just to be brutally honest, is most folks probably won't have a good sense of whether the decisions made in that operating agreement are good, bad, or ugly, and what the legal consequences of them are. And so I strongly caution folks. I mean, I'm not saying don't look at them, but
sure.
I guess
but don't make a law kind of thing.
That's correct. I mean, you do not want to rely upon an operating agreement that you find on the internet without understanding the reason, because there may have been legitimate reasons for whoever drafted that making the decisions that are made in there, but those decisions and circumstances probably don't fit your situation. And so it's okay to look, but I wouldn't rely upon them at all, because there's a lot of negative consequences that can result from that. And so what normally is going to happen if you go to someone who does business organization work as an attorney, they're going to walk you through the important decisions that the members need to make in drafting that operating agreement. And to put maybe a blunter point on it, if you go to the Secretary of State's website, there's a lot of great resources there, but one of the things you won't find is a sample operating agreement, and it's for obvious reasons, because of such different circumstances in each particular situation.
Gotcha, understood. Thank you.
Sure. Just a couple of wrap-ups here. This slide kind of identifies some of the other things that you definitely need to be aware of. As far as things that you should think about. Do I need to register for, are you going to be obligated for sales tax, unemployment tax purposes? Getting proper insurance is a really important thing, and understanding what coverages you have. Obviously, getting the appropriate business licenses and other permits, or if you're opening a business that has some sort of specific regulatory licensing requirements, there's a whole bunch of different types of industries that are very heavily regulated that require specific licenses. So I'll close with that. If there are any other questions, or if it's time to go for Shu, I understand too. So,
what do you think, team? Any other questions? Any reactions, thoughts? Yeah, I see nodding heads. Kim?
Oh, sorry, good information.
Yeah, very good information.
Good. Shannon, I'll forward the presentation to you so you can share it with attendees and your other members. So if there aren't any other questions, Travis, thank you so much for your insights, feedback. That was a lot of really good content, and it's easy to take some of these legal matters for granted. You're trying to expedite setting up a new business. You're trying to get through a lot of things that need to happen when you're thinking of setting up a new business. So it's easy to take some of these legal matters for granted. So anyways, we thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We'll post this recording on our Business 911 site soon.
My pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you all very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.